Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. For the Unit 1 debate, we're going to take a look at the democratizing or wisdom approach to viewing the Psalter. And that approach to interpreting and, in this case especially, applying the Psalms essentially says that David, King David, failed in keeping his end of the covenant he made with God, and therefore the emphasis of the messianic promise as made to David is no longer central to David himself or his bloodline, but is instead now dispersed throughout all of God's people through the wisdom of the Psalms. And this approach really follows in the footsteps of Gerald Wilson. Wilson is most noted for having taken an ambitious and systematic approach to looking at the Psalms as being collected and presented in the Psalter intentionally. That they're not just a random collection of individual Psalms, but that the order and the structure of the Psalter itself is intentional. And that it intends to actually convey meaning simply in its structure. And in the span of Wilson's research, he sees the Psalter mainly in two stages. Stage 1 is Psalms 1 through 89, and Stage 2, Psalms 90 through 150. And in the shift between Stage 1 and Stage 2, which is Psalm 89, that's where Wilson suggests that David has broken his covenant with God. And if you remember, it is in Psalm 89 where David is said to have written, "But you have rejected, you have spurned, you have been very angry with your anointed one," speaking of himself, "and you have renounced the covenant with your servant and have defiled his crown in the dust." And then as we finish 89, we're left with this picture of David waiting for the Lord to return to him and restore his covenant. Wilson then asserts that the rest of the Psalter, Psalms 90 through 150, deal with God's eternal promise and kingship being now given to all of God's people, with the Psalms as a central vehicle for that movement. In this case, and in this, God's kingdom will be ushered in by all of God's people, not just one person or one person's bloodline. In this way being David. There are a few things I really want to be sure to convey. First, this is a biblical approach to editorial criticism, specific to the Psalms. Some of you might disagree with the ultimate conclusions this approach reaches, but the approach is created from a study of the biblical text. I think that's important for us to understand because often in textual criticism or critical approaches to studying the Bible scholarly, we see attempts to use outside influences to aid the interpretive work in studying the Bible. And Wilson and the scholars that have followed in his footsteps have come to the democratizing approach through mainly biblical study. And second, I would expect one of the burning questions in your mind to be, what about Jesus? And that's fair. If the messianic promise is no longer to a person, David, and his bloodline to be fulfilled individually, how does Jesus fit in? And personally, I find that that's a bit of an unnecessary tension. The promise of Jesus has been given to God's people since God told Eve in the garden that her seed would one day crush the head of Satan. The promise of Jesus does not originate with David, and therefore is not dependent on God's covenant with David. If David was allowed to take part in the genealogy of the Messiah, then it was by grace, regardless of the status of the covenant. And then third and lastly, I would convey that David would not be the central figure in the messianic promise of the Lord, and that follows the Lord's consistent nature and character. I'm sort of painfully aware of how little I really matter. I think the Lord loves me and wants to use me, but I in no way think he needs me. And the same is true of David. God offered David an opportunity to take part in something special, but God is in no way required or requires David's involvement in order for his general will and promises to come through. And this is especially biblical for the Psalms. Dr. Lindo covers this in the lectures from Unit 1. Biblical Psalms do not have men or women, royals or non-royals, as their primary subjects of exaltation, like some of the hymns of others, non-biblical hymns. Biblical hymns, the honor belongs to God and God alone. Men like David are not central to God fulfilling his promise. God is still God. Hope that's helpful, and I hope you're well. Shalom.